Hi there, it's Pastor Greg. I'm continuing to talk about discretion this week on transforming the world. Today I want to examine the point behind questions number 3 and 4 in the self-evaluation section. Uh, Read over those questions and we'll discuss them when I get back. Number 3 says, are there activities which are not wrong in themselves but would be wrong for me? And number 4 says, when evaluating an activity, do I ask what's wrong with it or what's God's best for me? That's what we're going to talk about today. I'll be right back. If you have a Bible close by, open it up to Romans chapter 14. It's a really good chapter. It's a good chapter, the book of Romans, because it directly speaks to this whole topic of discretion about our actions, our words and our actions, and how they're perceived by others. In Romans 14:13, Paul says this. He says, decide to live in such a way that you will not cause another believer to stumble and fall. But the issue here in the Roman church, it surrounded food or meat that had been offered to an idol, some false god. It also surrounded some debate about what was the right day of the week that we should be worshiping. Jewish Christians said, well, Saturday's the Sabbath, and Gentile Christians were like, well, Sunday's when Christ rose from the dead. Why don't we worship then? So there was this argument back and forth about whether or not you could eat this food or that food, or what day you should worship. And Paul, in this chapter here, he basically calls the Roman Christians to be practicing some discretion. He says this. This is 14 and 15. He says, I know I'm convinced on the authority of the Lord Jesus that no food in and of itself is wrong to eat. But if somebody believes it is wrong, then for that person, it is wrong. And if another believer is distressed by what you eat, you're not acting in love if you eat it. Don't let your eating ruin someone for whom Christ died. So think about how your actions might affect someone else. Paul says, practice some discretion. The point here is that as Christians, and I know this is really going to challenge you. It challenges a lot of folks when I share this. But these aren't my words, these are Paul's words. And the point is this. As Christians, we no longer have the freedom to think only of ourselves. We don't. As Christians, we represent the Lord. And as the Lord's ambassadors, we must consider those around us. We are to decide instead to live in such a way that we will not cause another believer to stumble and fall. It's so important for us to remember that even though we may not be convicted about something, we must always be convicted about how others might be affected by our actions. And that's the point that Paul's trying to make here. But too often, when a Christian begins processing something about what's acceptable, what's not, what can I do, what shouldn't I do, where does my freedom lie? For most of us, we only think about how that will affect ourselves. We process the thing in our own heart and our own minds. We only search our own heart, and we fail to be sensitive about how our actions or our words might affect somebody else. Our Christian liberty just might be hurting someone else. Actually, to be honest, this is the mark of a mature believer. It is the mature believer that No, it's not that they recognize certain things as being wrong, but they consider how their actions might be perceived. That's the mark of a mature believer. Somehow it seems to me that the church has lost this whole concept of community. Christians too often end up arguing just like Cain. Remember Cain's argument, am I my brother's keeper? It's become the attitude of far too many Christians today. We live for ourselves. We have little regard for how our actions and attitudes may impact those around us. But Paul says, here in Romans 14, he says, Christians should live as community, as a member of one body. And the actions of one affect everybody else. This thinking, of course, is a foreign concept for most people, even for some Christians. Far too many Christians, the only world in which they live is their own, never considering how their actions are affecting those around them. They lack discretion. They are no longer being controlled by the Spirit. Rather, according to Paul, they are following their basic human nature. A believer who allows the Spirit to control them no longer merely thinks about their own desires and their own wishes. They consider others as well. And they use discretion to guide them through life. I want to talk about this some more tomorrow, this difficult topic of discretion. You've been watching Transforming the World, and my name is Pastor Greg.